Hello everyone, and I'm super excited to welcome you at our first webinar of the webinar series, How to Create Great E-Learning Content from A to Z. And today we're going to be talking about e-learning design and content roadmap. My name is Paulina, I'm a community manager at iSpring, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. And as a speaker, we have invited Michael Sheyahshe. Hi Michael, how are you doing?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Michael is an artist, author, developer, and technologist at Alternative Media, and he will be the presenter and the leader for the whole webinar series. We will have the total of 10 webinars, and I hope that you guys like it. We are a little bit nervous because this is the first time we are doing that series, so your support is very much appreciated. And I also want to announce a very exciting thing. So you guys are gonna get a bonus from this webinar series. But not all of you, but only 3 lucky ones. This is going to be the 60-minute online face-to-face consultation with the expert, 45-minute consultation, and 30-minute consultation. You will be able to talk to Michael, address him your questions, any questions that you have connected with your e-learning project. Maybe you are interested in some more tips and tricks. So anything that you have, you'll be able to ask Michael about this. And how you can get this bonus. You will need to answer this question. What did you learn during the webinars? This can be either this webinar, any of the webinars during this webinar series, or the whole webinar series in general. And you will need to post this answer under the general blog post. I will share the link to this blog post in the chat box, so you will be able to see where you need to go to publish your answers. And after that, you'll just need to have your colleagues, friends, family, peers to vote for your answer. And at the end of the webinar series, we will see who are the top 3 comments under this blog post, and we will provide you with further instructions on how you can receive this online consultation. So at this point, I'm gonna say just one more last thing. At the end of this webinar, we're going to have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please send them in the question box. It should be on the right side of your GoToWebinar panel. And I think it's called something like chat/questions. So please post whatever you would like to share with us there. And okay, at this point, we're ready to begin. So Michael, let me please pass the mic over to you.
Great, much appreciated. Thank you.
All right.
All right, sharing my screen. And Paulina, do you see my screen?
Yes, I can see it, and I hope all the attendees can see it as well.
Okay, good. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you. And Paulina, please alert me if someone comes in with a chat or question or comment as we go along. So first of all, like I said, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending. We really appreciate it. And so obviously the title today is Quickstart eLearning, Design and eLearning Design and Content Roadmap. So we have a lot of information to cover, both in this webinar lesson and the whole webinar series as one. So the series is how to create great e-learning content from A to Z. And again, my name is Michael Sheyahshe, and I know the last name seems rather difficult, but it's Sheyahshe. So I am a technologist at A&M and Alternative Media. A little bit of background about me, and this is the obligatory selfie slide. So I have a bachelor's in film, a bachelor's in Native American Studies, a master's of fine art in 3D modeling, and I've been working in IT and e-learning for 20 years now. So I'm currently a technologist at A&M. So that's kind of, as you see me discuss these different things, I've had a gambit of different sort of positions as we go along, from instructional design specialist, from graphic artist to 3D modeler, to programmer to web developer. So all these positions. So as you see me talk about these various solutions and ideas, that's a lot of where my information comes from, is you know, my personal experience within the industry. So what I really wanted to push home is all of these webinar lessons, and throughout the series, is very casual. My style is open-ended. I want all of you to have good information. I want you to know what we're talking about. I want to keep it conversational. So as I mentioned, if you have comments or if you need to talk about anything specific, please post them as soon as you think of them in the chat and we'll talk about them. But basically the most important aspect for me is group discussion and that we learn from each other. Because again, these are very intricate topics that take a lot of information. So I wanted us all to feel free and comfortable speaking with each other, because that's where most of the learning comes from, is from our peers and within the industry. So let's take a quick look ahead about what you can expect on this webinar series. And again, I said it's quite robust, so we've got a lot of information to cover. So you'll see these slides every week as I present, letting you know sort of where we are in the whole roadmap of how we're doing. So today, of course, we're talking about Quickstart, the e-learning design and content roadmap, and how you plan and how you prepare to create your e-learning content. So next week, we'll talk about the different roles, about SMEs, stakeholders, and where you fit into all this as far as the e-learning content design and development. So week 3, we'll talk about writing essentials, whether those you're creating on-screen text or you're creating for narration scripts. And those are really important as we continue, as we look forward about how to do the development process. And I'll talk about more why in a moment. Then in week 4, we'll talk about some tips and tricks and how you can do the audio and video narrating and editing right inside your iSpring authoring tool. Week 5, we'll talk about creating sort of more enhanced learner assessments and looking at the core essentials of quizzes and knowledge checks and assessments and what you can do to push those forward. Week 6, we'll talk about sort of making what we've done so far and create an interactive or more immersive or engaging content for our learner. And I'll stop right there for a second and say, as I continue to talk about these things, week by week, you'll see my continued passion for the learner. I'm always concerned and always focused on learner-centric, on making sure that whatever we're creating is right for your learner audience. So keep that in mind as we continue forward. So, and then in week 7, we'll talk about how we actually make these things into practical application, how we actually put them into practice. We'll talk about the user interface and user experience, about some best practices, how you can implement those in your design and development. And then week 8, we'll really put the polishing touches upon what we're doing, about what we've created so far. We'll talk about how we can make our courses and content more accessible to our various audiences. And then in week 9, we'll talk about how we can publish, how we can share these things, how you can get your content across different platforms or devices. And then finally in week 10, it's really about celebrating what we've done so far. We'll see some really great examples of content creation. We'll see what we can look towards, or some websites and some ideas to get information and actually push our content creation further. So that's sort of the encapsulation of the webinar week by week. Again, I'll have this up in the subsequent webinars just to sort of let you know where we are in the entire process. So, but let me just quickly tell you what to expect in this webinar. And again, this is the obligatory objective slide, so I understand we need to get through these, but I really want you to know all the information encapsulated as I see it before we get started. So those of you that hate objective slides, I'm with you, I understand, but let's get through this so we can get into the meat and the important part of the content. So we're going to be talking about what I see e-learning is and what, when I refer to it in this webinar series, what it means. We'll talk about the methodologies used briefly and see some of the processes. We'll talk about what I see as the content roadmap. We'll look at an overview of a more detailed experience of what to expect. We'll talk about planning tools. We'll talk about what to do before you open PowerPoint and some additional considerations as you continue to create your content. Then we'll get into tips and tricks and some time savers here and there. But really what I want you to know as we continue through this content, what we're going to talk about is the best practices and tips and tricks based on my personal experience from creating content both in the initial stage and to the deliverable. So we hope that you follow the information, but again, we're just giving this information as best practices from my perspective. So let's talk about what I see as e-learning when I discuss this. So you'll hear me interchangeably talk about it. But first off, when I talk about educators and trainers, who am I talking about? Well, there's a lot of different, as I said, I've had a lot of different professional titles, and within that. So really what it gets down to is, we're talking about you, whatever your role is, whether you're a trainer, instructor-led designer, all these things. Really, we're talking about how you, as someone that's creating content, creating e-learning and training, how you can increase your skills, how you can do this easier, and look at some of the roadblocks and traps ahead. So when I talk about e-learning, really what I'm talking about is the conceptual nebulous stage all the way to final delivery. So when I talk about that, you'll hear me talk about e-learning or e-learning content or instructional design. Really, I'm just using these phrases to talk about this entire process of creating and authoring something that, you have an idea or you have an existing refresh that needs to be done, getting from that sort of planning stage to actually getting it out to your learner. And so I don't want us to get hung up on the, the instructional design part or the theory, which is very, very important, especially in gathering, as you'll see in the methodologies momentarily. But what I really want us to focus on is getting it out there in a succinct and effective manner. So while I do that, Paulina, let's put up a poll question, the first one, if you don't mind. I'd like to get everyone's how they see, what their role is. So.
Sure, just a second. Okay, can you guys see the poll question? Okay, great. All right, so if you can quickly take the vote and let us know what is your current role, and if it's other role, could you please share in the question box with us?
Yes, thank you very much. So I'll let you all answer that. So basically, I just wanted to point that out. I want to get a feel for what you all as the audience, your role is, what you feel your role is. And again, if it's not one of the ones listed, just throw in what your title is. The titles to me are not necessarily the important part. What I want to do is get a feel for all of your perspectives and your focus. So I'll let that run just for a few minutes. Paulina, please jump in a moment and let me know when we have some of the answers so we can talk about it. So as we talk about the design and development and the e-learning design, instructional design, all of you know and probably work within different methodologies, Waterfall, ADDIE, SAM. Probably your organizations or your clients expect you to work in an agile or iterative Scrum-like environment. So in today's trends, more than likely, all businesses are looking towards agile or iterative. So each of you may or may have your own methodologies that you work in. You may love it, you may hate it, but we all have a specific pipeline that we work in. And I won't be getting into the differences of these because very obviously or very probably you know what you're dealing with at your organization or with your clients. But more importantly, what we want to understand is that there is a pipeline or a process that we have to go through no matter what, and even if it's our own internal process. So
okay.
You'll see. Go ahead.
Sorry for interrupting, but it looks like everybody has voted. So I will close the poll right now, and I will share really quickly the results so we can see that there are a lot of other people, other roles, and the most are instructional designers.
Good. Okay.
All right, so let me hide it right now, and then we'll get back to your slides. Okay, thank you, Michael.
Sounds great. And Paulina, okay, so I had a flashing icon. I thought it was flashing. It's not. It's someone raising their hand, but just double check that and let me know if anyone has questions or comments. So
sure.
Okay,
sure.
So again, finishing up the methodologies slide, we're just talking about there's different pipelines and processes for everyone. Won't be getting into the nuts and bolts of each of these because one, I expect you know what your process is, and two, that would be an entire webinar series on its own. Remember, we're not here to train you how to be an instructional designer. Basically, I'm here to share my knowledge and some tips and tricks on how to get that content out to your learner. So when we talk about pipelines and methodologies, so that aside, we'll be looking at some core concepts, sort of like my distilled version of what you can expect in the content. So of course there's the planning stage where you're gathering all your information and data and identifying who the key personnel are, who your SMEs are. And again, this is where you would hopefully identify, sometimes they're called RACEs, which is roles and responsibilities or such, but this is where you would identify everyone's understanding of the project or the content itself and each of their roles that they need to play in each. So, and I mentioned here hedging your bets. This where you plan the stage. Hopefully this is also where you would schedule the stage. So you would plan what each phase or stage of your particular e-learning content project would be. Hedging your bets for me just means that you have allowed enough time and given yourself enough padding in each of the phases, whatever your phases are in your specific content, that you don't get caught up at the end. And we'll talk about some of those issues a little bit later, but this is where you would plan that out. So of course you would also need to understand what's the purpose of the content as you plan, of course. You know, who is this for, which we'll talk about in just a moment, but looking just beyond, here's what I have to do in the content itself, but here's what I want this content to do. You know, by the end, my learners should do this, or my, you know, my group should know that. Understanding as you put your own personal goals, and it doesn't mean sort of the listed objectives that you normally see at the beginning, kind of like I did today. It can mean that, but it can also mean how viable or what level of ability do you want someone to have at the end. So again, within that same vein, you know, understand your learner, your audience, and that's going to be my personal soapbox as we continue forward. Make every decision based on your audience, on your learners, and that's very important to me, and it's been crucial throughout my career. And so again, part of the understanding of your own process is working through, yes, all the nuts and bolts of your particular methodology or process, but really what's in it for the learner, and that's just as important or more than most times. And with that, what sort of device are they using? What do you expect learners to do? Will they be reading this on the subway, train into work? Is this something that they can take home? Is it just-in-time learning? Do you somehow, you know, have stuff that augment and support your learning after you train them? These are the questions you need to answer, ask and answer as you go along. So you'll need to understand creating for different devices and understand how they look on different devices. So you'll also need to think about learning platforms. Now, we all love, and I put that in specific quotations, we all love our LMS or our LRS. Haha, no we don't. So that's okay. But many of us have to work within the learning management systems, and so we understand that. And with that, of course, sometimes comes testings. You know, if your SCORM package is currently communicating with the LMS, these are things that you'll need to include. Remember, I talked about hedging your bets. In the QA section or in the QA phase, the quality assessment, quality assurance, and specifically in producing for the LMS or the LRS, some testing needs to be done, so make sure you allow time for that. And then, of course, we'll talk, as you think about it, think about how items look on different devices, how the learner experiences it, and especially these days in sort of a mobile-first environment. So this is sort of a loose collection of things I like to talk about within whatever methodology it is in. You know, who's the key players? What is the reason for this learning? Who is my audience? What devices are they on? Where does this have to live after I've created it? And what is the best experience and the best succinct layout for my user? So, so what I wanted to show you is not only my take, but also the take on what we can see from industry standards. So I'd always like to share this information. So this is not mine, obviously. This is from the Chapman Alliance, and you can go out, there's the link there. You can go out on the web and view this. The Chapman Alliance divides their e-learning into 3 levels. Level 1, which I jokingly call page turners. And those of you that know what I'm talking about know that that's just what everyone is forced to take, that you just go through it as quickly as possible. It's just, you know, pages of slides and a little bit of images. Level 2, which most of us will deal with primarily most of the time, which is a little bit of images, a little bit of interactivity, some media, some video. And then level 3 would be sort of those really immersive simulations, maybe video games, but sort of the high level learning. And as you can see, based on what, you know, the Chapman Alliance, there's a lot of steps that go into creating e-learning. In fact, based on this table, and I'll make this larger for everyone. Okay, there we go. There's a lot of tasks involved, and you can call these phases or tasks, but there's a lot of work going on to create e-learning content. And you can see based on this estimate, and again, this is average time from a survey of a lot of different e-learning professionals. It takes about 184 hours to make a finished seat hour of learning. Now, again, there's a lot of give and take in there, but that's a good look at what's going on in the industry. From front-end analysis, so we talked about sort of the planning stage, from instructional design, the storyboarding, the graphic work, AV, audio, video, narration, into programming it and making sure your SCORM packages are firing off complete. And again, like I said, QA testing and all these things. There's a lot that goes into it, and many times your clients or your stakeholders may not understand that. So I always like to show this really good looking snapshot of what's going on in the industry. So I wanted to share that with you as well. Be sure, if you're interested, to go out to this website, take a look at the different studies they've done and the different information. So that's sort of what we look at. And one thing I wanted to bring up is, as you see listed here, front-end analysis. So many of you have to do business analysis or gap analysis with your instructional design phase. We won't be covering that. Again, the instructional design part of e-learning is quite robust and quite enhanced and more out of scope in this particular than this particular lesson. So I just wanted to alert you to that. So Polina, what is our next poll question? Remind me.
The next poll question is about team or a one-person shop.
Let's go ahead and throw that up if you don't mind. And so throw that poll question out to the group. And then when we get done, we'll continue, because I think that's a good segue into this.
Right. And actually, we had some of the answers that, let me actually quickly find it. When people were answering that, yes, we have the other role, they would say a combination of all or all roles.
Right. And that's to be expected. And in fact, I think we'll have a poll question a little bit later that sort of asks that same thing. So.
Right. So actually, almost everybody voted on this poll question. So I think that maybe right now that's a good time to close it.
Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and close it.
And
again,
here are the results.
Okay. Let me open up the...
All right, so it looks like 53% of our audience work in a team and 47% are one-person shop.
Right, that's very interesting. So that's good. And so thank you for sharing that. So I appreciate you having that question up. So it sounds like about half of us are working teams or one-person shops, and so I've done both, and so that's very interesting. I think many of you will note that there's, it's kind of funny, sometimes there's a very different method of working either just with yourself. Obviously, there's different people, but those of you that are one-person shops know that you don't necessarily work with yourself. You have to work with your clients, with their SMEs, with their stakeholders. So it's interesting that, you know, I'm sort of based on the poll, it's sort of half and half, but I've done both, so I understand each of the pain points and high points of those. So we'll talk about that in just a minute, but I'm glad we shared that. So when we look at the planning and pre-development stage, what I really want to talk about are things that you should consider before any content is created, before any assets are assigned. And these are things that you could consider before you even open PowerPoint for the first time. So, of course, we talked about gathering information, gathering data. So who's my audience and what's their story? And I put story in quotation marks, specifically for those that work in Scrum or Agile methodologies. You'll remember that, you know, what is the learner story? Those small vignettes and questionnaires that you have to answer for yourselves, this learner story. So, and again, some of this we've already talked about. What is the device and what's the platform? These are the information that you'll need that'll sort of shape the content as you go forward. And the planning stage, of course, many of us work in storyboard. When we say, okay, we have to create storyboards for this, some of us call it wireframing. And there's a lot of information that needs to go into that, working out some of the kinks as we go along. This is also in the planning stage where I would suggest agreeing on the visuals as a group or having your clients give you the okay. and this includes, font colors and those types of things. I'll talk about that in a moment. And of course, in this planning stage, we really want to know who the core people are, who we ask questions to, who we get approval from, whether it's our clients, whether it's our internal project, and that sort of thing. So we want to know the schedule and the timeline. We want to make sure that we understand that timeline and understand any padding we need to build into it. So this is where I would really, really spend a lot of time identifying any instructional design roadblock, any content creation roadblocks, anything that may come up that you might not expect. And of course, unfortunately, we don't know what we don't know. That being said, you can only give yourself enough plan Bs or escape plans. But remember, when working with a bunch of other humans, it's very important that you understand things happen. And so we want to make sure that we have a contingency plan no matter what. So as I mentioned, doing the initial agreement or getting sign off on the visuals is very important. So as you begin developing and planning, one thing I like to suggest sometimes that some people are very used to and some are not are mind maps. And it's a really interesting way to get in and see what's involved in the content and how you see it branching out and what that has to do with. And so these are interesting items not only for your own consideration, but to bring in your clients and your stakeholders and get their ideas and see how their personal viewpoints can potentially shape what's going on in the content. So another thing that I always like to do, especially if I'm working for a one-person shop, is get client sign-off on what I call a design document. And that would be the colors and the fonts and the graphic resources and how it's going to look. Now, you may have in your team a person that will do this, or they usually handle that part of it. However, it's always good to at least have a place to go back to it. So we loosely call these visual design docs or other things. So some of these can be handled inside PowerPoint itself. And so as we go through, you might see me reference many of these things from a PowerPoint perspective or iSpring suite perspective. But I really want you to know that we don't have to necessarily go out and find new tools each and every time. Some of this can be handled right inside PowerPoint or whatever tool you happen to be using. So I want to make that clear as we go forward. So a lot of other things that you need to really consider as we continue to create the content. So assets are very important, especially if we want to go from that level 1 page turner to a level 2, more interactive, more robust content. These would include things like photos, videos, backgrounds, and of course audio and narration, and even something as simple as what font choice. And for those of you that understand the theory of fonts and how they look on the web, you'll understand that idea and concept alone is quite robust and something that could, again, take up several lessons in itself. So if you have key individuals, again, identifying those, someone that you really trust and know has expertise in this area, please leverage them. Otherwise, I would say it's a good idea to understand what industry standard is. And there's a lot of good resources I'll share later about what's going on. So in that, also, as I mentioned, working with other humans, whether you're a one-person team, a one-person shop, or working on a larger team for a corporate enterprise, understand that things happen. There's different roles, different goals, different personal perspectives, even different schedules. Someone's going on vacation, someone has to take leave for whatever reason, as well as, quite frankly, some different personalities you may have to deal with. Some of these may, unfortunately, adversely affect your content creation as you go along. So be aware it happens. We all deal with it. We all know it's possible, so you're not alone. But again, it's something you need to prepare yourself for. And also, as I mentioned, what else should be considered? Well, remember that people that are outside of your realm of control, like the people that QA your stuff, even if you do your own stuff, you know that it actually takes time, both to go through whatever your content is, as well as to document any bugs or issues, and to get that fixed in the turnaround. So make sure you plan for these as you do your content creation. So as we mentioned over and over and over, understand your target devices and what your learners will be looking at your content on, and make sure that it's accessible to your learners that need that. And we'll talk about all that, the accessibility conformance a little bit later in a different lesson. So, and we'll also make sure that you understand your assessment questions. Do you have people writing questions for you? Are you pulling from a question bank? Is it centralized? Where is this? Who has access to this? So understand those and know what those are before you get into it. So if those questions come up, you have them readily answered. So, talking about tips and tricks, we'll talk about little things you can do to make sure that you're successful. Again, you've gotten a little bit of these as we go along. So pitfalls to avoid. So less is more. So that's not necessarily a pitfall to avoid. What I mean by that, of course, is that when we look at writing for the screen, or when we look at narrating something, or even having text versus images, having a very clean and succinct screen or content for your learner is very suggested and highly needed. So make sure that you have less and you're succinct and you're telling your story in a very, you're communicating your ideas in a very effective manner. But I say less is more, except when it isn't. And of course, what I'm talking about is providing information either on screen or in the vehicle that you're providing for your learners, but allow them to get more information where needed. And that can be as simple as creating resources, links, a list of glossary entries, whatever it is. Make sure that your learners can dig deeper and dive deeper for a deeper learning experience. So pitfalls to avoid: scope creep. It really goes without saying, and those that know what scope creep is probably are cringing. Feel free to share your scope creep stories in the chat. So scope creep, avoid it. And by that, I mean anytime the scope of the content project or your learning project, again, anytime the schedule continues to get bigger or longer or extends because of whatever reason, there's a lot more feedbacks. One of your stakeholders says, wait, I forgot to tell everybody this. Scope creep happens, whether it's on a large basis to kill a project or a smaller basis just that adds a couple more days to a project. But it happens, so we need to understand it. And while we cannot avoid it, I just want to make everyone aware that it exists. We all deal with it. We all have our war stories from it, but that we need to make sure we do things to have a contingency plan before that. So in that same notion, re-edits happen, especially in the audio narration phase. Things are written out and they're approved and they're said and stakeholders are sneezed, then realize there's more information that needs to be, and they just happen. So re-records happen, re-edits happen. Just know that we can't avoid these in most cases, but we can do things in the planning process that allow us enough time and our clients and our team to make this happen. So, and another pitfall to avoid, believe it or not, is people and testers not being familiar with the LMS, not understanding how SCORM works or XAPI, whatever your particular communication is, but not knowing the platform well enough to communicate with it. Now, that doesn't happen often, but I want to alert you in case you are creating content and placing it on your client's LMS, or if you are living on your own LMS, sometimes things come up that you'll need an LMS question answered, and it may not be readily answered. So have a familiarity with SCORM, XAPI, whatever it is, before you go in, to at least be able to understand those things. And again, this webinar series will not go into LMSs and LRSs, learning record stores, for XAPI, because again, those are very complex and intricate topics. So before we talk about the save time and resources, Polina, I believe we have one more poll question.
Yes, we actually have two.
Two, yes, sorry.
So which one would you like me to launch? About the clear process pipeline, etc.?
Yes, please.
All right. Okay, so here's the poll question. Do you have a clear process, pipeline, etc. established to create e-learning? So could you guys please share with us whether you have it or not? And while people are voting, let me please read a comment from Alan regarding the scope creep. He says, scope creep happens to us based on bringing in top-level executives for red line review near the end.
That's very unfortunately true. And as you may hear me say over and over, whether it's in real life or on these webinar series, I have a personal hashtag that says hashtag scope creep sucks. And it really does. It sucks. And as this person mentioned, when you get other people involved, sometimes those are stakeholders, sometimes they're higher ups, sometimes there are SMEs, and sometimes, guys, believe it or not, the scope creep happens because of us, because of our oversight or not enough planning and this and that. And that's why I continue to talk about give yourself enough padding in your schedule and know your process in and out so that you can identify areas that you know are going to have significant consequence on the schedule. So.
And we have a really quick question from Darren regarding scope creep. How do you handle additional billable time for scope creeps and re-edits?
And that's a great question. I think any of us that have done a one-person shop or know that we have clients, that's a hard question. Open and honest and transparency within your process, going back to your client or your stakeholders and say, look, this happened, and understand it, that it needs re-editing. There's no easy way to answer that question, and I'll just say that right up front. But it needs to be something that you plan out before, as you reach whatever agreement it is with your personal team or your own team on a corporate level or from your clients on a one-shop sort of thing. That needs to be agreed upon. What happens if there are re-edits? What happens if the schedule goes beyond? And that's not ever an easy topic to broach, but it needs to be broached. Unfortunately, and I've been in the case where stuff happens and re-edits need to happen. I don't want to say this out loud, but sometimes I've had to say, okay, look, I'm going to take one for the team. I'm not going to charge for this, but I definitely learned my lesson the hard way, by not getting paid for my time, to make sure I have those hard conversations with my clients before we do that the next time. So that's a great question, and I wish I had a ready answer, but I don't. It's just something you need to plan for and either learn your lesson by not getting paid or make sure that you have that clause in whatever contract you sign.
Awesome. And before we move on, just wanted to quickly mention a comment from Karen. Get management involved early on in the process to help establish the scope.
That's a great point. And just like, unfortunately, what was mentioned earlier, that may increase the development time. That may affect the schedule. But it needs to happen. You need to have as buy-in and approval from as many people as possible and understand their own personal point of view. If you have different personalities, you have one person that doesn't believe in mobile devices, that's fine. You still need to get their buy-in on the importance of the core concepts of the content. Meaning, even if there are different personalities, and even as mentioned earlier, if someone with red line veto power comes in, get them in early, get that out of the way, and deal with it, and allow that padding in your schedule so you understand that. So those are good points. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, that's what I wanted to share from other comments from our audience. And you can see on your screen the result for that poll question. So more than half of our audience don't usually have a clear process or a pipeline established.
That's very interesting. So thank you, Paulina. I appreciate that. So we'll throw the other poll question up in just a moment. But so I want to comment on that just briefly, and let me go back. So sorry. So that being said, I think that's very telling. And I think the 30 or so % that said, yes, we do have a process or pipeline, if we put that poll question out again, I would bet more than, a good majority of that 30% would say, well, we have one, but, it's not really followed. But it's, we have one in name and we give it lip service. But that's very interesting. So, around 2/3 of the people that answered that poll question don't have a particular process. And here's what I want to say about that is develop your own succinct process, whether or not you call it ADDIE or methodology or waterfall or SAM. Take one and live in it and learn it. And if it's the same one that your client has or whatever your internal team is, that's great, but use it. And whether you give it that name or not, this is Sam's plan, this is Tracy's plan, this is Bob's plan. Live in it and understand it and know it. And that's very important for the process. Now, that being said, these processes and methodologies are very, very important. But what I'm really getting at is not that they are more important than what's going on for your learner. They're important to get the job done. And that's sometimes very important as well. And I want to bring that up, that if you don't have a process, is go out and find one. Probably Agile or Scrum, a Scrum-like methodology. Addy's been around forever, so that's one many are familiar with within our industry. But go out and live in one and understand it and flex in it and use that to your ability and your power. So I'm glad we asked that question, so that's very good. So going back to that, so within any of those pipelines or methodologies, understand that there are ways that we can save time. Again, as we look forward in time and see how we're planning this entire process, we want to think about what's going to take the most time. And remember, I talked about recording audio, recording video, re-edits. So the earlier you can hammer out the scripts for those, the earlier you can hammer out any sort of framework to get those done, the earlier you can have the appointment scheduled to get the video captured, whatever it is, the better. So the earlier you can do it in your process, the better, because things happen. Schedules slip. People can't make it. People have a cold and can't record audio that day. Re-records and re-edits happen. Make sure you take the time in your schedule and in your planning to know that's going to happen. And those of us that have worked in different groups and different clients know that that's a hard task to do. Understanding that you have a succinct and sometimes compressed timeline and schedule to turn things around means that anytime there's any delay whatsoever, it blows a project out. So be very careful and understand these things, in my experience, have really put a project behind. When everything was done, everything was buttoned up, the course looks great. Oh, and we just found out that there's something really important left out of that person's audio. We have to go re-record it. That takes time, not only to re-record it, to re-edit it, to get it back to us, to get the audio cleaned up, to get it back to the course, so that takes time. So again, think about these things and each and every nuance as you get forward. So establish your conventions early. So that's something we don't think about, but as any of you that have done any programming know, if you've looked at someone else's code, you know that commenting code is very important. So the same thing as we're looking for archived files, or we have a file sharing system, we need to establish these naming conventions early, what version control is, and of course those that have used programming or that are programmers or developers have used Git, and different repositories or version control. So there's tools out there to help us and understand at what point something is archived. You may have version 1 through 99. At what point are versions 1 through 98 archived, and we say this is the current version. Establish those as a group and identify them and document that, so people, when they ask again, where's the latest version, you can pull up this documentation for them. And when possible, leverage tools you have. In this case, we're going to talk a lot about PowerPoint. We're going to talk about how you can use it to storyboard and wireframe, how you can even create complex animations. Remember when I said less is more? In some cases, you can have an entire set of what you would normally do in slides or screens and have that in a really nice, succinct animation for your learners, rather than, again, doing the level 1 page turners. And we can even do audio and video capturing and editing. We'll talk about that a lot later, but these are things I want to remind us that save times and resources. So as we look at saving time and resources, there's always going to be that Google search, the research out there that you do. And I just wanted to throw up some really key places to go and get some information. These are some big places that I normally see when I continue to reinvest myself and reinvigorate what's going on, whether it's what's going on as an industry or what's going on just as my other professional experts are doing, and seeing what's going out there. Now, I'm not promoting any of these. What I'm saying is these are really good repositories that I see continuing to pop up on my Google searches, my research. So I want you to be aware of those. So we're about to finish up. Paulina, let's do the final poll question. I think we have one more, right?
Sure, just a second.
Let's do that. And then really what I want to do is start getting us ready to have an open discussion and talk about key things that you want to talk about, not only from this session, but the series. So go ahead.
All right, so can you guys let us know if you or your group have a process? Does everyone stick to it? And you can choose either yes or no for that one.
And this really goes back to that last question. So remember, we were talking about the process. And while about 2/3 of you don't necessarily have a succinct process, it'd be interesting to find out whether or not you're sticking to any sort of unnamed process.
Yes, and while people are voting, let me please go a little bit off topic and let everyone know that after this webinar, we will put together a blog post that will have the information, like the script of this webinar, or like a little summary of it, and also they're recording the presenter's presentation. So I will be happy to send the link to this blog post to all of you guys because you have attended, and it also will be sent to everyone who registered I'm sorry for this webinars, because sometimes it's really hard to attend because you might have the work meetings or have other stuff planned. We completely and totally understand that, so we will be more than more than happy to share that information with you. So yes, you will receive these resources. And I'm sorry, Michael, please go ahead.
No, that's fantastic. I really appreciate that. So that'll be a great resource afterwards as well, and a great place to share ideas and continue this discussion. So I really appreciate that from you guys doing that. So it looks like polls are pretty much done.
Yep, and let me share the results really quickly. So it looks like for 73% of our attendees, not everyone sticks to the process that their group has.
And that's not surprising, especially based on that they're, 2/3 of the group didn't have a specific process. So I think that's really good to talk about, and I think that may be one of our discussion points. So we really want to talk about what's involved and whether or not there's a process. And remember, like I said, develop your own process. So I think that's a good way to think about it. So let me go ahead and leave my information up, but what I really want to do is open it up. So we've covered a lot of broad information. But what I want to do is talk about from your perspective as designers, developers, programmers, graphic people, all this stuff. Really, what are some of your pain points? What do you see as the development process? What is some of your own personal pipelines and processes? Really get into it. And so this will be sort of the pattern that we follow each and every time is come to this table and be ready to talk about your own problems. And as a group, I want us to make sure that we understand that each of us have something to contribute, whether it's like, oh, I've had that same problem, or, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. How do we solve that as a group? So, Paulina, are there any questions coming in or ones that we haven't read so far?
Yes, of course, we have some that we haven't covered. And for example, the first one, when you say developing a process, can you develop a general process even if you design very different training topics, formats, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So let's just take a look as we go here. So let's go back into this one. So these are my slides, everyone. So what I want to do is open up this slide so that I can kind of talk about it. So take a look at this. Now, again, this is from the Chapman Alliance, but developing your process. So take a look at what's involved here. Look at all those tasks. Now, you could list those out in your own process and go, okay, I know what each of those are, or I don't, but you could list those out, and each of those could be its own phase in your project. So you certainly can develop your own, and believe it or not, this would follow ADDIE, and depending on how you phased this and made the feedback requirement, this could be agile. So you could make these each, their own stage, their own phase, their own deliverable. So you certainly can. And I think many times, even if we work in our own methodology, or whatever our team methodology is, we have our own personal process that we do, no matter what it's called. But I think just look at this, so go out to the Chapman Alliance website, take a look at this particular website, and there's a lot of other slides that deal with this information. This is just one slide of maybe 35 or 40 slides, but it's a very intricate level of what's involved. Now, as I mentioned, when we talk about that, front-end analysis and gap analysis and business analysis is highly complex. So just having a one-liner there doesn't give it, the robust, explanation it needs to. But look how much time it takes. It takes almost 10% of the entire e-learning development process. And for some of you, that's probably not quite enough. It may take you, almost 15%, so depending on your authoring a program platform. So it really depends. But each of these have a succinct level. So you can certainly use this as a basis to start your own. So that's a good question.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And a question from Darren. Do you write it into the contract X hours, anything additional costs Y.
And so here's the thing, and so I'll be quite honest. So none of this learning series is about writing contracts or making sure that your personal business works. But that would be a really great topic itself. But I've been in a situation. So there's a lot of discussion going on right now, and probably has been for a long time. But I've noticed in social media there's a lot of posts and a lot of discussion on LinkedIn about should we as consultants, as e-learning consultants or development consultants, should we be parsing our time out hourly? And there's a lot of discussion of, well, no, because you're just saying 1 hour of my time is only worth so much. Now, I'm not going to get into that, and I do agree with a lot of that. But those of us that actually have to have subsistence based on our business that we bring in know that we have to do contracts, and sometimes we have to write whatever form that our clients put out. So getting back to your specific question, having that open and honest discussion with your client is very important. There's a succinct meme out there, or something on Twitter I saw recently that basically this consultant wrote out, so listen, you don't screw me over, I don't screw you over, and together we'll make this product. And that's all their business contract was. And so having that level of trust, having that level of buy-in before, including conversations before, and in your succinct verbiage in your contract helps. Now, that probably doesn't solve or answer your specific question, but again, it's very complex and understanding. So that being said, anytime you have a contract, there's this, how you lay it out, the scope. But as well, there's also the contingencies. This scope is based on your participation, blah, blah, blah. Anything outside of that will be billed at such and such hour. So again, there's ways to write it. You have to deal with your own client and whether or not they agree or don't agree with that. So business cases alone for how to do consultant-based e-learning content creation is well beyond out of the scope. But I tell you what, let's start that discussion if you want to inside here and see what other people say. But I appreciate you putting that question in.
Thank you. And we have a question about this particular slide that you currently have up from Mike. I think the slide is useful for coming up with benchmarks. So roughly 185 hours development per 1 hour of training is a good guideline?
I think it's a good place to start. And I've always liked this because it's so succinct. Now, again, you'll notice at the bottom right or bottom left, this is from the Chapman Alliance in September 2010. Now, that's when the research was pulled. And then, of course, they had to, develop the data and such. But it's a really great place to start. And when you think about it, when you start laying out, especially if you're a consultant, divvying out your hours for a client, really looking at this as, well, do I agree with that or not? Can I do storyboarding quicker than, say, 20 hours or so? Probably. But 20 hours is half of a business work week. So when you think about it, you're putting in 2 or 3 hours a day for a couple of days, getting buy-in and approval from your client, and that really adds up to about the same. Now, I do think, like I said, this is a great place to start. That doesn't mean that it's the end-all and be-all, that these numbers don't float. They flirt too. But I've been in very different situations wherein it's taken 200 plus hours to develop something that was level 2. Some of that had to do with re-edits on audio. Some of it had to do with establishing the LMS communication. Some of it had to do with, the storyboards were not approved by the SMEs. And I've been on some that have been as little as, say, just 90 hours or so. Because the content was a little smaller, or we had already agreed upon certain things and were succinct. So again, I don't think this is the ultimate guesstimate of what's going on, but I think this is a really good, succinct way to look at it. And I think if you present this to your business partners or your clients or your stakeholders and show them everything that's involved and let them understand this is just a snapshot, that each of these particular tasks has a whole bunch of subtasks that need to be taken into consideration, I think you'll get a lot more, understanding and buy-in from your clients. So.
Great. And we have a comment from Guido. I'm surprised that the need analysis, front-end analysis, is below 10%. I understand it's average, but I feel it should be higher. Could you name the range for this line, please?
And I agree. And in some cases, it It definitely needs to be higher. So I think that probably a lot of us are surprised that it's not higher. So I don't know that there's a specific range. Again, I'm not part of the Chapman Alliance, and I didn't get their data set. But just speaking from my own personal experience, it's gone anywhere from lower to more like 7% of the total time to on up to 20%. And some of that has to do with personalities. Some of it has to deal with whether or not this is new territory as far as creating content or the learning from a new concept. Some of it has to do if this is just a refresh. It really depends case by case basis. But so 10%, okay, maybe that's a little low, but in some cases it's not going to take that much on the front end. Especially with those people that do the gap analysis, business analysis, and front end analysis. If you have a person, or if it's you on the team, you probably know what's going on pretty well. So those that have done it before, have run those traps before, know what to look for, know how to ferret out that information quickly. So in the long scheme of things, I think if you had more than 10% on the gap analysis or the front end analysis side, you would probably exponentially, very slightly, extend your project anyway. So if that was more than 10%, you would probably have a little bit incremental in each of those stages or phases or tasks, making the project a little bit longer anyways. So I think it's a good place to start. I agree with it might be on the low end, but again, these are data sets gathered by Chapman. So, and quite frankly, like I said, it's 2010 information. They still have it out. I grabbed that slide from their website just like a couple of weeks ago, but it's the same information that's been out there. But I still think it's viable and a great place for us to start those conversations, just like you did.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. And a question from Carl. Put this as perspective of iSpring and PowerPoint, a relatively simple platform. Wouldn't that reduce the work hours for delivered hour or content?
I think it certainly could. So basically, I'll restate the question, and maybe I'm not quite getting the nuanced version of it. But so when we go back to this, it takes 184 hours. Sorry, my slide didn't want to pull up, but let's pull it up here. So if we just sort of use that 184 hours, isn't using an authoring tool like iSpring, shouldn't that reduce the number of hours needed maybe in the authoring and programming side? Sure, it certainly could. So 184 hours, let's say that you say, hey, look, everyone, look, my client, look, my stakeholders, look, this is what we're going to do. Here's industry standard 184 hours. I'm going to use this specific platform, say iSpring, and instead of taking 32 hours for this one seat hour, I'm going to be able to do it in 20 hours or whatever it is. But you're right, it can significantly reduce. And I'll tell you what, the entire part of this webinar series is to do just that, is to get items both on your desk and out the door in an effective manner, and hopefully reduce that number of hours needed. Now, that doesn't mean that we're trying to take something and make it less succinct, less effective, just put out stuff that we wouldn't be proud of. What we want to do is continue to put out content for our learners, learner-centric content that we can be proud of, but do it in a very effective and very succinct manner, and hopefully one that doesn't have any scope creep. But I think that's a great question. So anytime you use tools or even have these discussions, hopefully it will reduce the overall time needed.
Awesome, thank you. And could you please describe what is level 2 eLearning, and how many levels are there? Question from Oliver.
There's a joke on Kung Fu Panda, the movie, where there is now a level 0. And so in the Chapman Alliance, they talk about 3 levels, and I like that because it's easily consumed and understood by clients or stakeholders. And so within that level 1 would be, as I mentioned, sort of just the page turners, just slides, maybe no images, maybe 1 or 2 images, but just slides of text that you click through and click through the slides. Level 1, and I don't have those numbers up because I continue to focus on level 2, as you see in front of you, which has various slides. It has quizzes or knowledge checks. It has some level of interaction. It relies heavily on graphics. It also probably has some audio. So that's what most of us live in. That's what most of us deal with. I say that, there's a lot. But level 3, again, would be the immersive simulation type, where if you're doing software training, you have the actual software tool up. Someone can run through it in a test environment, or even like a simulated environment like a game or a serious game. Something created with Unity or something on a mobile device, or creating content that's both level 2 and mobile device, just-in-time learning. So these different aspects make it level 3, and it exponentially shoots up how much time is spent on each seat hour of finished product. So that's kind of the encapsulation. I like that because it breaks it down in 1, 2, or 3, which really for my clients is easy to understand, knowing that they'll probably, whatever I'm creating for them will probably be in level 2.
Okay, thank you. And I also shared a comment from Mike, a link, I mean, in the chat where they have the description on the Chapman Alliance site.
That's exactly right. And that's the same link that you can look at this information. So thank you.
Mhm.
And that's also available on the slides. But yeah, so that's what we're looking at. And I'll go back to that slide. Here it is on the screen as well. In case you're not seeing the chat, I'll put it here. And again, that's what they were talking about. That's the same link that they shared. How long does it take to create e-learning? So the entire slide deck is about that. So how long does it take us? Well, here's a succinct table that says around 184 hours. But just like you guys asked, what about level 1? What about level 2 and 3? And so it goes through each of those and why and what the industry standard was. So it's a pretty robust look at what's going on and a really good snapshot. So.
All right, thanks a lot. And if we go back to the methodologies, what about mixing ADDIE and an agile methodology?
And I think so that's a good point. So I always think there's probably going to be some mix, some level or some hybrid. In many cases, as you know, as I mentioned, many of our e-learning partners or our groups or internal groups are looking towards a more agile look. So remember that ADDIE can be an agile methodology if there's an iterative continuation, so if there's a back and forth. And I think we'll find more and more of that. So sort of to answer that question is it depends. And I think that even though we may be in one particular methodology, I think that you'll find maybe your business partners or maybe your clients will go, oh, well, we need to be agile. Well, understand what that means and go out and find some information or talk with some people that use that methodology. Again, we use that now in e-learning because software developers and application developers have used that for a number of years. The fail fast, but get it done and get out the door. Now, some of those concepts really work for e-learning. And if your group is using agile methodology or Scrum methodology for that, great. It works. It keeps you in constant contact. You have constant, reworking. Everything's modularized, so you may have some people working on this or that, but at the end you come together. So there's some really great tools to take from that and really great methods to use. But you may find that you still, at least on your development side, you're working in one or the other. So I would just understand what it is that it's expected and make sure that you're able to flex with that environment.
Awesome, thank you. And we have a question about seed hours. What exactly do you mean by seed hour? Is it reading time? How does one estimate seed time? Can we talk of it in terms of number of slides or screens, or can it be linked to number of words across the course?
That's a very complex question. So I'm laughing because so the answer to me that I've used and that I've been told before is that seat time means butts in seats, means people actually sitting maybe at a computer, maybe at their desk, learning or training or whatever it is. Now, how do we get to that number? Well, that's an interesting topic. In some cases, you may find that it's a minute per slide. If you have a 20 slide deck, or you have created something in an e-learning tool that has 20 different screens, maybe that's 20 minutes. Maybe it's not. Because here's what happens is we're talking about our learners. So there's a difference between talking about here's your level of involvement, because that's kind of what we're guesstimating. And I use that word specifically, we're guesstimating it. So seat time is just that sort of generalized guesstimate of hours or time that a person may be associated with this training. Maybe you have an e-learning training that is very robust, but really only has 5 slides. But what if each of those slides has a really interesting 2.5-minute vignette from a video from YouTube or one that you've created, or an introduction to a topic by a really renowned expert? Your learner will probably have more time involved in that slide or whatever it is in order to get through it. So, but let's also take about, if you have 10 slides, maybe that's 10 minutes, maybe it's not. maybe you have additional resources available, documented PDFs or policies out from the federal government, or any additional information. Perhaps you've created a small mobile app that shows someone step by step and pictures only how to do things. Again, how much time is invested from your learner? And those are things you need to discuss and discover as you think about how to create that content from the initial concept on. Is what do I expect my learner to do? Because of course we all want our learners to go, oh, that's really great, that's cool, I want to know more, or how do I know more, or look, this content provider said, here's 5 or 6 other things you can do to learn more, and that's great, but we can't put a specific time frame on those because it differs not only from our content, as I just pointed out, but it's going to differ for each learner. Let's say I read faster than other people, or I read slower. Something that it takes me 5 minutes to read, someone else can read in a minute and actually have better retention than I do. Same thing with in the vice versa. So it really depends. And I laugh because that's a funny question, because you'll get that asked quite a bit. But keep those in mind and just sort of give someone an approximation to the best of your ability.
Oh, thanks so much, Michael, for covering that question. And I think the last question we have time to cover today is from Karen. We are new to iSpring and starting to build process trainings and machine trainings. Do you approach these two types of training differently to start, or is it approached similarly?
So between process training and what type of training?
Machine training.
Okay. So it depends. So that's a good question. So it would be almost, so I have people that ask about VR, virtual reality. So I talk about that sometimes. And could you use it to teach agile methodology? Well, maybe, but it's a process. It's a conceptual thing. So I think no matter whether it's conceptual or it's machine learning, obviously with the machine learning, there's certain concepts that need to be pushed forward. So, the soft answer is, well, yes, they're kind of the same, but really, even if you have two process-oriented learning contents, they're going to be different. So there's no way to say just across the board, everything's the same, we're going to do it the same way. So, but what you can do is understand one concept from another. So I would open up that to the group. Those of you that have done both or one or the other, do you find differences? I would say it depends, but I really think that within using, the tools you have, say it's iSpring for creating screenshots and explaining things, or understanding concepts and creating those animation vignettes, and we'll talk about those things a little later lesson. But those ideas and concepts are really interesting. So anything you can do, whether it's explore a concept or physically, I say physically, or visually show someone how to do it or what to do, understanding the methodology behind it is sometimes just as important or more important. But again, you have some learners like, just show me what to do, I'm done. So it really depends on your learner, not only the content itself.
I hope that answers your question, Karen. And I think that at this point we are ready to wrap up. I would like to thank you, Michael, for putting this together. And I received a lot of comments from our attendees that they really enjoyed this presentation and they're looking forward to the next webinars in this series. So thank you very much for doing that.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Paulina. I appreciate it.
All right. So at this point, I would like to remind everyone that we're going to have the next webinar of this series next Wednesday, and I will be sending the invitation message rather soon. And you are also welcome to register for all our webinar series in our blog, and I am going to share the link to that blog post just one more time in the comment section. And I'm sorry, in the chat, of course. And also, I wanted to say that I would like to thank you guys for participating and for asking your question and sharing your opinion on what Michael was talking about. And we are going to put up the post in our blog that will include the video of this webinar, the presentation from Michael, and also I will try to include some of your comments, the relevant comments to the topic, so that everyone can see them. And I will be sharing that blog post as soon as it's live. All right, so at this point, I wish everyone a wonderful day and we'll see you at the next webinar. Bye bye, everyone. Bye, Michael.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye.